Hi guys, I decided to start this video outside today and just kind of show you the outside of the Clack Shack, because other than my cover on YouTube and maybe a few pictures, typically all my videos are done either inside of the shack or up the hill by the mill or at the bees or whatever. So I want to start this one in front of the Clack Shack, and this is my original The Clack Shack sign. And a little backstory, I made that sign using a router and a piece of wood that I had cut on the mill probably 2 years ago or so. And that's what kind of gave birth to the name The Clack Shack from my YouTube channel. Is a friend of mine who's a YouTuber, and kind of suggested that, you know, rather than Clack's Custom Creations, which is what I originally started it at, I should probably call it The Clack Shack because she liked the sound of that. So also in this video, I'm going to be dropping a little bit of a hint for some of her followers that may be watching. So keep your ears peeled. You might learn something on this video that May doesn't know that you're going to know about yet. But today I'm going to be taking some stove covers I worked on the other night. I told you guys about it. I had got the wood planed down. I start with 4/4 board, plane it down to 3/4. And then I joined the boards using Titebond 3 glue and some biscuits, and marry those things up, clamp them, and I let them sit overnight before I start working with them. Well, that was yesterday, and so today the clamps come off and we're moving forward towards the engraving phase. And I'm just going to kind of walk you through the process that I use to do those. I make a little bit of money off those. I mean, I don't make a killing because I try to keep my prices affordable and economical, but you know, you can sell these things depending on how customized people want them. You can sell them and make a little bit of money. And according to my poll, there's a lot of you guys out there that are trying to figure out how to take this hobby and make it into making money. And the way that you do that is you need to find something that you can offer your customers or potential customers. You need to find something you can offer them that they can't get anywhere else. And so the process that I'm fixing to show you, there's not a whole lot of tools that it takes to make these things. The wood is going to be the big thing. Is you got to find a good source for your wood, make sure the wood's good and dry. But stick around and we're going to move inside and get started and show you where we go from after the glue up until after the engrave. All right, guys, I just got the clamps off of this board. There's going to be a stove cover here soon. And what this is this is 3 7.5 inch pine boards that are 3/4 inch thick. I cut the wood at 1 inch thickness, and then I plane it down until I get it to 3/4. And that's what I make my stove covers out of. It's a little thicker than what a lot of guys make them out of that use store-bought lumber, because they have to start with 3/4 inch. And then by the time they get them planed down or whatnot, you end up with only a 1/2 inch thick piece of wood. So the way I do it is I start with a 1 inch piece of wood, and I work my way back down to 3/4 on the planer. And then I join the board together using my biscuit joiner and some number 10 biscuits. Glue it up, let it sit overnight, and today we're taking it out of the glue up. And what I've got to do is I've got to square this thing up. When I cut these out, I cut them at 32 inches. And put them together. My end product, I want it to be 30.5 inches. So once I take it out of the glue up, then what I've got to do is I take and square this thing off so that I can make sure that this is one continual cut on the outer edges of this thing. I guess that's part of my OCD. Plus it just makes it easier because you end up with just one solid line and all the edges are even because the boards are glued and they can't move. So I'm gonna go ahead and my trusty little battery operated DeWalt here. Once I get that in straight, I've got one continual cut, so it's basically, it looks almost like it's a piece of plywood. Then I got to make sure that the overall width of this thing needs to be 30.5 inches. That's what my stove covers are. and it fits most standard stoves. And so I'm gonna go over and mark my 30.5. And once I get that marked, then I just trim the other end. And that's why I like making them a little oversized, so I can trim them back, and it just makes it a little more precise. It works out better for me that way. All right. So now I've got it to where it is the dimensions that I want. Everything is square. I've got one continual cut on both sides of this, and that's the way I like it. The next step is going to be to sand this thing down. Any of the glue spillage that may have came out, or any little minor little ledges that may exist near where the boards go together, I want to knock those down. And the way I do that is with my sander, of course, and I use 80 grit for my first pass just to get the high spots knocked down, and then I'll go back over it with 120 once I get that done. So give me a minute and let me smooth this thing down a little bit. All right, guys, I got the 80 grit run done, and so now I'm gonna step it on up, and this is gonna be some 120. The 80 gets everything flat. It gets it semi-smooth, but I like 120 a little better for my second run, and it'll actually slick it down a lot more. I did get rid of any little lips or ledges that might be between those two boards. I got that knocked down, and so now we're just going to go with a little bit more smooth finish. And I have found that the smoother the finish on the wood, it seems like it engraves a lot better. And I'm sure there's some science behind that, but I have better luck with my engraves on a smooth board as opposed to a rougher board. So I'm going to get the 120 done. All right, guys, I've got the sanding done, and I'm going to bring this over here where you can see. Like I said, this is 3 7.5 inch pine boards that are joined together, and you know, I try to get my cuts to match and marry up as good as I can, and the table saw does a pretty good job. You just got to take your time and be careful with it. But this is going to be my canvas for the burn, and you may notice that there's these tiny little dots on this board, and I'll try to get it to where you can see it. Maybe the camera will cooperate with me, but those are actually insect burrows made from powder beetles, little powder post beetles they call them. And the person that ordered, the company that I'm doing these for, they wanted them a little more rustic, and so this kind of gives it that reclaimed wood look, and when you stain it, those little holes will be a lot darker, and so it just adds a little something to it. But it's cool, and it's one of those things that when you look at it, you can tell that that's not your average wood. And if you look at some of the definition and the color in this wood, it's hard to find that kind of wood in the stores today, because they use that fast growing trees instead of these naturally occurring ones. But anyway, the next step is I've got to get this thing set up to engrave, and the way that I do that is I've got my little mechanical pencil, because I can make faint marks with it, and I got to make sure I'm at 22.5 and 30.5, and I am. And the way I'm going to do that is, of course, 22.5, half of 22.5 would be 11.25. So I'm going to make me a very faint little mark right here at 11.25, just enough that I can see it. And then I'm going to come across here, and this is 30.5, and of course that's going to be 15.25. And I almost got that right the first go there, guys. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make me a little plus sign right in that center. And what that little plus sign is for is, once I get it over to the X tool, I will line up the crosshairs on the X tool with my little plus sign that I made right there. And that'll help me get everything oriented to where I'm centered and squared and all that. And we'll go over to the machine, and I'll show you that process and how I go about doing that as well. All right, guys, I've moved on from the sanding phase, and now it's time to engrave the stove cover. And I know I did a video before on how to align everything and how to make sure you get everything centered, and that was the technique that I used. But now that the orders for these stove covers, I'm up to 13 now, total orders, I had to come up with a little bit quicker way and a little easier way to do that. And so some of you may notice sitting right below the front legs to the X tool is what appears to be one of my interchangeable jig plates. And that's exactly what it is. I took that jig plate, glued and screwed it to a piece of wood that's the same thickness as the stovetop covers. And I've put me a little center line right here marking the center of the workspace. And also I've got another little line on the stove cover itself right there at the bottom edge. And so those two I can line up, but over here on the right, the board sticks out past the stove cover a little, and I also have a timing mark over there. So if it's a 30.5-inch stove cover, I can take this little slider board here, put it up against that 30.5-inch stove cover and slide it over until I get my timing mark right, and I know that my jig is centered with the stove cover. And then once I get all of this lined up, I make sure my timing mark is good there, and I've got everything lined up. It's fairly simple to get everything going. Let me grab a clamp. I've walked off and left my clamps, guys. So once I get the stove cover, once I get it lined up, it's centered. I've got it centered over here, and everything, this is up against the stove cover and it's flat. I can take these shorter clamps, these are just lightweight clamps because I don't need a whole lot, and I just put those along the edge of this board and the stove cover, and I put just enough pressure to hold that thing still. You don't want to over crank it, put too much pressure that it moves. You just put just enough to hold it still. And then on this side, I do the same thing. Take this clamp, edge of the stove cover to this front piece of this board right here that I'm using as a jig, and just tighten it down just enough to keep all of this solid so that it won't move. And now the X tool will not move independent of this board because of the jig plate that I've got fastened to this piece of wood. And my stove cover is now, without putting screws in it or attaching it, it is now attached to this front board, and that holds everything together. So I don't have to worry about anything moving. It's there. I can slide this thing around, and I don't have to worry about my engraving moving. And the reason for that is I have had situations to where my engraves, somehow something moved, and that's a real pain when that happens, guys. I mean, that is seriously a real pain. So as long as all my marks are still timed up like they're supposed to be, finding the center of this workspace is simple. I did the crosshairs here when I drew it with my pencil, so I've got a crosshair right here that I can verify with. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, just because I don't want this machine doing anything crazy, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rehome the machine and make sure that it knows where it's at and we're ready for a burn. Once it's rehomed, then I'm going to go over to my Move tab. I've got a preset location that is set to center. I'm going to click that, and that's going to send that gantry over to the center of the workspace. Now, it's not going to be quite on my little mark that I made because of the fact that I've got this spacer, my legs are down here, and I've got the feet, the back feet are securely up on top of the stove cover. But what I'm gonna do is, I've got my distance for increments set to 5 millimeters on here, and I'm just gonna bump the arrow button on this little movement display here, and I'm gonna move that guy up until I get it to where it is on that X that I made earlier. All right, so once I get it to where it's on that X, it looks like it needs to go. Once I get it on that X, I know that that is the physical center of that workpiece. So with all of my graphics grouped together, because you got to have them all graphics grouped together to do this, I'm then going to go up here and I'm going to click on the little button that says move to laser position. All right, once I do that, now I just need to frame and make sure everything frames correctly. All right, so just to protect my eyes and also in the event of a fire, I'm going to take this Sculpfun here and we're going to put it over the top of everything. I do need to slide everything over. And see, that's the good part about having this jig made together and everything being attached is I can move it. I can move the entire rig around, and it's almost as if I'm over on my enclosure. So I'm going to push this to the back so that it doesn't get in the way of anything. Make sure all of my cables are out of the way. It actually wouldn't hurt my feelings to be able to lift that thing up a little bit, but let's frame it one more time and make sure nothing's binding or the enclosure is not sitting on any of my cables. And this is going to be kind of the setup for my 10 watt once my Pro gets here, because the Pro's going in the enclosure. The 10 watt is going to be used for doing stuff like this. So that's kind of my plan. All right, now that I've got that set up, I'm going to go ahead. My power settings, I'm running a really high power on this because I know that this pine is really hesitant to burn. So I'm going to go ahead and start this guy up. And the first section of this is basically a trace of the circular design that's on the stove cover. It's just going to run around and it's going to do a thin line everywhere that the engraving is going to be. I like doing this just to give me a visual of what it's going to look like, but it also seems like it helps with the when I start staining it, it helps keep the stain from bleeding over as bad and makes it nice and dark. So I'm gonna let that start, and once it does that outline, it'll actually start the engraving. It should be coming around on that here in just a second. So I'm gonna move the camera up where you can see a little better here. All right, there you go, guys. All right, so it's done the little sketch, and now it's gonna go back and it is gonna do the actual burn itself. It is going to smoke a lot. That pine, the stuff, it really smokes. So I don't have any kind of fume extraction or anything on it yet. This is more or less just I'm trying this technique and using this enclosure. I may end up putting me a air exhaust fan in this corner somewhere with a little removable hose so that I can set this thing up and use it when I need to. But like I said, this isn't necessarily going to be a permanent setup. So I'm going to go ahead while that's started, and I'm going to let the little door down. And like I said, I'm not going to close it and zip it up because I don't have any fume extraction and I just don't want to smoke my machine up real bad. Right now, I'm just using that to try to help make sure that while I'm over here working on something else, I don't turn around and look at it and hurt my eyes. And if a fire does try to break out, maybe it'll slow it down anyway. Because I do know that it is definitely flame resistant because I tried setting it on fire in the last video, if you remember. But anyway, guys, that is my new approach at doing stove covers, using a jig and a modified version of my interchangeable jig file. Whew. All right, guys, I really hope that maybe this will help you out. I know, like I said in the previous video, I had a method of doing this, and it worked. It was a lot more time consuming, but as always, the tools and the techniques that I develop are kind of a product of necessity. And the fact that I've done, this is number 6 for this particular, actually this is number 7 for this particular customer. And the repetition of these things, it got me to thinking that there had to be a better way of lining everything up and making sure everything stayed where it needed to be. And so then was born the interchangeable jig on a board design here. But the jig works, and all I did was I took the interchanger, the locking jig for the interchanger, and I took a piece of wood that was a scrap piece of where I made these stove covers. I put some wood glue on that, slapped it together, and put some screws in it, and I just took it over to the table saw and I cut board, interchanger jig and all, just to leave that strip that I needed to hold those legs. And that's how I developed that little tool, and it keeps the X tool from moving and makes sure everything stays where it's supposed to be. So if you have my jig file and you bought it on Etsy, then you too can have one of these if you have a table saw. If you don't have a table saw, for the rest of you guys, you probably won't be making stuff this big anyway. But you know, if you do need this, then just find you a friend with a table saw and some glue that can help you design one of these of your own. All right, I got it out of the X tool. Everything came out good. You can see what I mean about this pine. And if you ever try to engrave pine, you'll notice that this darker wood right here, let me get it in there where you can see. Okay, if you're ever engraving pine, you'll notice that these darker little veins of like the growth rings, so to speak, those things won't engrave as deep as the whiter wood right there. So if you're trying to do an image or something on pine, you're gonna get these little horizontal lines that run with the grain, and that's just a part of pine. It's a really grainy wood when it comes to the density of the wood in the center versus the white wood versus the density of the darker wood. There's a big variation there, and so you're going to see those little lines like that, and that's nothing unusual. And as you can see, I got a little bit of charring right here from going so slow with so much power. But my cure for that is I take my sandpaper here and just lightly sand it. Like I said, that's a 220 grit. I'm gonna go ahead and hit the rest of it while I'm at it. And with that 220, it takes a lot to really remove a bunch of material. So give me just a second, let me get some air on that, so that you can see what it looks like once we get it sanded. And if you aren't using compressed air to clean out your engraves, you're missing out, guys, because it gets all that little ash and stuff out of there. All right, so as you can see, I got a good deep burn. It's actually down in the wood. It's recessed like I like it. It's got some really unique detail to it where the laser came in. I'll get back there and try to get the camera and get a little closer where you can see some of the detail in these leaves and stuff in this design. All right, guys, there you go. As you can see, there's a lot of detail. Let me get this focused. A lot of detail in those lettering, and it is recessed in there pretty good. So there's no danger of that smudging or smearing off. I mean, that's in there. I've got all the ash out. That is simply the color of that wood after engraving. And it's got some real fine, and I'm not doing a great job with the focus, but there's some real fine lines inside that graphic. So, but that's just regular pine, guys. All right, guys, these are going to be the 3-inch boards that go on the side. Now, I haven't cut them to length yet, but these are going to be the 3-inch boards that go down the sides of this. And I cut those while we were doing the engrave there and got those ready. And then I'll have a set of handles that'll go on here also. But before I finish, I'm going to go ahead and run a coat of stain on this and just let you see. I've got another one under here that I've already done. It's already stained. I'm going to move it over here out of the way. So the stain that I'll be using is Minwax. It's an early American stain, and if you're staining pine and you want to get that like rustic look, I guess like you could say, this stain has just enough of the blacks and just enough of the browns in it to really make this. It really sets this pine off that we have around here. So I'm gonna go ahead and go over this with some stain so that everybody will know what it looks like after the stain. Hopefully, and you never really know until you stain it, but hopefully this particular piece of wood won't contrast too dark and make my burn go away. So I'm gonna go on really thick, really fast around this burn, and I'm actually trying to squeeze a little extra stain down in that recess to let it soak into those fibers that were cut by the laser. And then I'm going to go real quick and wipe the outside so that the outside doesn't have enough time to really stain dark, because this stuff will, the more you put on there and the longer it sits, the darker the image or the darker the stain will be. So you don't want to go too crazy with this stuff, other than in the engraving, because you kind of want to pour it to the engraving so that it'll make it darker than the rest of the wood. And that's the way I do it, is I kind of squeeze it, kind of like that little hole right there. If you just squeeze a little extra, let it soak down in there, it'll make that knot hole a little darker, and it gives you a little more contrast. Now, wood is wood, and it's going to have its darker spots, and it's going to have its lighter spots. And if you remember me telling you that these folks wanted these boards here to be a little more rustic, you'll notice that everywhere one of those little powder post beetle holes is, it's got like a little black speck on it, or a little line where those powder post beetles were. And that's what a lot of people like. And if you take and just press the rag down in that hole and let a little extra stain go down in those holes, it'll make them go dark. And that gives it that rustic look that everybody likes. So, and you want to do the same thing with your engrave. If you have any light spots, just kind of press some down in there. And then, like I said, don't let this stuff sit in one spot too much, because if you do, it's going to go dark, and only way to make it back light is to sand it. So once I get that done, I'm going to take a semi-clean rag. This one's not clean, but it's dry for the most part. And I'm just going to wipe this over to make sure I don't have any, tall spots or thick spots on my finish. And there we go. So it's fairly simple to make these things, And I actually do pretty well. I can't keep up right now with demand for these, so obviously they will sell. So that is the base of this one is complete. The next phase will be for me to take my 3-inch boards, and I've got 2 of them now that I've got to do. And I'll take those 3-inch boards and I'm going to glue and place those here and here. And then I'll bring in from the back, I'll use some 1-inch Craig screws, and I'll come through there and I'll pull that together, but it'll also have glue on it. And what that does is these joints, even though I biscuited them and glued them, the joint is still going to be the weak point in this. But by putting those runners on there, it kind of ties everything together, makes it nice and snug, gives it a frame, gives it that nice finished look. And it also gives you something to put your handles on that distributes that weight evenly across all 3. It turned out pretty well. And if this video helped you out, let me know, give me some feedback. If you know of a better way, feel free to comment, send me a message or whatever. But I'm going to get back to work because I got more of these things to turn out and not a whole lot of time to get it done. So I appreciate you stopping by. Please hit the subscribe button and have a good day.